The first thing Arthur noticed when he woke was the smell. Not the copper stink of blood he'd grown used to over the past 3 days. Something older. Something that belonged to a universe that had not yet learned to bleed. He lay still for a moment with his eyes closed, listening. The ventilation shaft above him ticked in a slow, irregular rhythm. Somewhere deeper in the facility, a pipe groaned under pressure it wasn't designed to hold. And underneath all of it, underneath every other sound, was the low harmonic pulse that hadn't stopped since the ships appeared over Sao Paulo. A sound you felt more in your back teeth than your ears. A sound that made fillings ache and old fractures remember themselves. Arthur opened his eyes. The ceiling of Sector 4 was the same dirty white it had always been. A fluorescent tube buzzed on and off on the far wall, casting everything in a strobe-sick flicker that made the stacked server racks look like they were breathing. He'd been using a coil of Ethernet cable as a pillow. His neck told him this without hesitation and without sympathy. He sat up, checked his hands. Still human. He did this first thing every morning now, before he did anything else. He didn't know exactly what he was checking for. The infected didn't change in any visible way. Not at first, not for hours, but checking had become ritual, and ritual had become the scaffolding that held the days together. His name was Arthur Mello. He was 31 years old. He had been a network infrastructure technician at the Federal University of Sao Paulo's Computational Sciences Annex, which was a job title that meant absolutely nothing, in a world that had, over the course of 72 hours, been stripped to its most fundamental negotiation. Are you still yourself, or are you something else now? He stood, rolled his shoulders, crossed to the small barricaded window on the east wall and pressed his face against the glass. Outside, the courtyard was empty. The 3 bodies he'd dragged away from the sector door 2 days ago were still there at the far edge, crumpled against the chain-link fence in postures that looked almost restful. He'd covered them with tarps from the maintenance cupboard. It was a useless gesture. The rain had pulled the tarps sideways hours after he'd laid them, but it had felt important at the time, and feeling something had felt important, and so he'd done it. He turned away from the window. Benjamin was awake. He was sitting in the corner behind the server rack, the one corner of the room where neither flickering light reached, and his face was a pale oval floating in shadow. He was 18 years old, a first-year student, who had been working the night shift in the data center when everything started. He had his knees pulled to his chest, and his arms wrapped around them, and he was watching Arthur with an expression that was trying very hard to look calm and was not quite making it. "Still here," Arthur said. "Still here," Benjamin confirmed. It was how they started every morning. A small, stupid ritual that had grown up overnight like a weed and was now somehow load-bearing. Arthur crossed to the supply cabinet and took out 2 of the remaining granola bars. He set one on the edge of the server rack near Benjamin without comment. Benjamin picked it up and unwrapped it with the careful deliberation of someone making a resource last. "Leticia?" Arthur said. Benjamin nodded toward the inner door. "Hasn't come out since last night. How long has she been?" "I don't know. I was asleep. I woke up and she was already in there." Arthur looked at the inner door. It was a standard fire-rated panel, with a narrow strip of safety glass near the top, and through the glass he could see the faint greenish glow of the emergency power strip that Leticia had rewired on day 1. She was a postgraduate researcher in applied biophysics, 26 years old, and she'd rigged an ad hoc monitoring station out of 3 laptops, a bench oscilloscope from the electronics lab next door, and approximately 40 meters of signal cable she'd scavenged from the corridor, while the corridor was still safe to enter. She was trying to understand what had happened to them. To the infected, Arthur knocked twice on the door, paused, knocked once more, their code, the lock disengaged, the door opened. Leticia looked like a person who had not slept in 32 hours, because she hadn't. Her dark hair was pulled back in a knot that had started neat and was now threatening structural collapse. She had a dry erase marker behind one ear and a stylus behind the other, and she was wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing since Tuesday. She stepped aside to let Arthur in, pulled the door closed behind him, and immediately turned back to her screens. "I found the carrier frequency," she said. Arthur looked at the screens. 3 of them were running waveform displays, green lines spiking and collapsing in patterns that meant nothing to him. The 4th showed a satellite image, probably pulled from a cached academic archive, since actual satellite feeds had gone dark on day 2, of the Sao Paulo metro area, with hand-annotated overlay circles centered on several locations. "The ships," he said. "Not the ships. The signal the ships are generating. She pointed at the oscilloscope trace. This is what you get if you filter the ambient acoustic environment down to the 11 to 14 Hz range. Subsonic, below human hearing threshold. The ships have been broadcasting it continuously since they first appeared. What does it do? She hesitated. I'm not certain yet, but I've been running correlations between broadcast intensity zones and reported infection spread patterns from the first 48 hours. She tapped the satellite image. The overlap is not random. Arthur looked at the circles on the map. They were centered on the highest points in the city. Broadcasting towers, mountain ridges. The ships themselves, hovering at altitudes his mind still refused to fully process. Each one the size of a metropolitan district, moving at walking pace through air that should have been filled with fighter jets but wasn't. Because whatever the ships had done to GPS and targeting systems had apparently also done something to military coordination. And the world's militaries had spent the first 24 hours in exactly the kind of confused, fragmented paralysis that the ships seemed to have been engineered to produce. They designed it, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. The frequency is too specific to be accidental. 11.4 Hz modulated at a rate that maps onto human amygdala resonance. It doesn't infect, it sensitizes. Like priming a fuse. She pushed her glasses up her nose. The secondary agent, whatever it is, airborne, contact spread, we don't know yet. It does the actual work. But without the acoustic priming, I don't think the secondary agent would take hold the way it has. Arthur sat down on an overturned crate. He thought about what she'd just told him. He thought about the 3 bodies under the pulled-aside tarps in the courtyard. He thought about the last person he'd seen change. A security guard named Ferreira, a man he'd worked alongside for 2 years, a man who had a daughter in Campinas, and kept a photo of her tucked into his ID badge. Ferreira had been fine at 6 in the evening. By 8 he had not been Ferreira. There's something else, Leticia said. She was quiet for a moment. The signal has a repeating pattern. It's not random broadcast, it's structured, like a language. You can't read it. Not yet, but structured means purposeful. And purposeful means they planned this. She turned to face him, and for the first time since she'd started working in this room she looked genuinely afraid. Not of the infected in the corridors. Of the implication. They've been watching us long enough to know how we work, how our brains work. They built a tool specifically for us. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, then we build a tool specifically for them. She looked at him. If they needed to prime our neurons before the secondary agent could work, he said, that means the system has a dependency. Break the dependency, you break the system. He stood up and looked at the oscilloscope trace. 11.4 Hz. You said that maps onto amygdala resonance, okay. What disrupts it? Leticia opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the trace, looked back at him. He could see her doing the thing she did. The rapid, sequential, merciless sorting of variables that made her very good at her work, which was finding the weak seam in complicated systems. Constructive interference, she said slowly. If you could introduce a countersignal at the same frequency but opposite phase, a 180-degree inversion, you'd create destructive interference. The 2 signals would cancel each other out. Can you generate that signal? I can generate it on this equipment, yes. But the broadcast radius would be about 4 meters. She paused. We'd need the building's acoustic infrastructure, the HVAC resonance chambers on the roof. They were designed to dampen vibration, but they could theoretically be repurposed too. She stopped. The roof, he agreed. Neither of them said the rest of it out loud. The roof meant the corridors. The corridors meant moving through the parts of the building that were no longer safe. It meant passing through the section that they had been carefully, methodically, desperately not entering for 3 days. Arthur went back to the outer room. Benjamin was still in his corner, the granola bar wrapper folded into a very small, very precise square in his palm, the way you do a thing when your hands need something to do. He looked up. I need to tell you something, Arthur said. I know, Benjamin said. Arthur stopped. You know? I've been listening through the door crack since yesterday. Benjamin stood up. He was not as tall as Arthur, but he was solidly built, and he held himself with a kind of deliberate stillness that Arthur had come to read as controlled fear. Fear that had been taken into a back room and talked down and persuaded to behave, but fear nonetheless. I know what the roof means. I'm coming. You don't have to. I know. Benjamin picked up the length of pipe he'd been keeping next to the server rack since day 1, salvaged from the broken towel rail in the men's washroom. Not elegant, but weighted correctly for the purpose it was for. I know I don't have to. I'm coming anyway. Arthur looked at him for a moment, felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. Okay, he said. They prepared. This took 2 hours, which was not 2 hours of efficient preparation. It was 1 hour of actual preparation and 1 hour of the quiet sideways process of getting ready to be afraid. Looks from the outside like people being very slow about packing a bag, but is actually something else entirely. Leticia built the count signal emitter into a hard-shell laptop bag with the oscilloscope board. It stripped down to its essential components and a small speaker array she'd soldered together from salvaged equipment. She had a transmit cable that would need to be physically connected to the building's HVAC control node on the roof. The whole assembly weighed about 4 kilograms. Arthur found 2 more improvised weapons in the maintenance cupboard. A crowbar, which he kept. A fire extinguisher, which he gave to Benjamin and explained, was both for the infected and, if it came to it, for the smoke it would generate. A visual disruption more than anything else. Something that might buy half a second. And half a second was worth thinking about. They ate the rest of the granola bars. There were 6 left. They ate all of them, not because they were hungry, but because carrying them made no sense now. Leticia stood at the inner door with her laptop bag over one shoulder, and the dry erase marker still behind her ear. She hadn't noticed it, or had noticed it, and somehow couldn't bring herself to put it down. It was a small, ordinary thing from a world where ordinary things still existed. And she looked at the door like she was running a last calculation, and it was almost but not quite finishing. Whatever happens up there, she said. This matters. What we found. Even if it doesn't work, someone needs to know about it. The dependency in the system. The counter frequency. Someone in a lab somewhere, with better equipment. Write it down, Arthur said. Everything. Leave it here. If we don't come back, someone will eventually open this door. She nodded, took out a legal pad from the desk drawer, and, for 4 minutes, wrote in the small, dense, fastidiously organized script that Arthur had learned was her natural handwriting. She tore the pages out, left them on top of the bench oscilloscope, weighted down by her spare pen. Arthur unlocked the outer door. The corridor was dark. The emergency lights had switched to their lowest power cycle, bathing everything in a dim amber that turned familiar shapes into uncertain ones. The linoleum floor reflected the amber light in long, wavering smears. The bulletin board at the corridor junction still had a flyer pinned to it from the Graduate Student Association's end-of-semester event. The paper now curled at the corners, and Arthur had a moment, just a moment, a single breath, of something that was the precise shape of grief before he pushed it down and moved. Benjamin took the right side of the corridor. Arthur took the left. Leticia walked between them and slightly behind, one hand on the strap of the laptop bag. They moved slowly. They moved quietly. They'd agreed on signals before they left. 2 fingers flat against the air meant stop. An open palm meant listen. A closed fist meant go now, go fast, don't look. The first 2 floors were empty. Or empty of the infected, which was not quite the same as empty. There were signs. A chair knocked sideways in the break room. A coffee mug on the floor, still half full and now cold and with a skin on it. A fire door that had been pushed open from the wrong side, with enough force to crack the frame. Scratches on the stairwell wall at approximately shoulder height that Arthur did not let himself look at for more than a second. They reached the 3rd floor. The stairwell door here had been wedged shut with a chair jammed under the handle, from this side, which meant someone had done it deliberately, which meant someone had been up here after the first day, and had had the presence of mind to barricade this door. Which meant, it meant something, and not necessarily something bad, and Arthur eased the chair loose with the slow, millimeter-by-millimeter patience of a person who understood that noise was the enemy of all good outcomes right now. He pulled the door open. The 3rd floor corridor was not empty. There were 3 of them at the far end, clustered near the exterior window. The infected moved differently from people. That was the first thing you noticed. The thing that your brain tried to rationalize as unusual gait or neurological event before it accepted what it was seeing. They moved like people who had been reprogrammed at the level of instinct, but not retaught the surface behavior. The motion was technically correct, but the intention behind it had changed. The way a puppet moved by different hands still looked like the same puppet, but felt profoundly wrong. Arthur held up 2 flat fingers. Everyone stopped. The 3 infected were facing the window, looking out or doing whatever the thing was that looked like looking out. One of them was tapping its palm against the glass in a slow, regular rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, pause. It was the most deeply unnatural sound Arthur had heard in 3 days, and he had heard a lot of deeply unnatural sounds. They needed to pass through this corridor to reach the roof staircase. Arthur pointed to himself. Then to the left side of the corridor. Then he pointed to Benjamin and mimed going low. He pointed to Leticia and placed his finger on his lips and pointed straight ahead. Walk, quiet, don't stop. Benjamin looked at him, then at the three figures, then back at him. His face did a complicated thing and resolved back into that deliberate stillness. And he nodded once, and Arthur thought, this kid is going to be fine. If any of us are going to be fine, this kid is going to be fine. They moved. The corridor was approximately 30 meters long. Arthur kept himself between the infected and Leticia's side of the corridor, which put him closer to the window side, which meant, if any of them turned, he'd be the first thing they saw. He walked on the balls of his feet, weight distributed, heel never fully landing. Something his sister had taught him when they were children, sneaking out of the apartment to watch the sunrise from the roof of their building in Villa Mariana. And he thought about her now with a precision that was almost physical, the specific warmth of that memory pressing against his sternum. They were 15 meters down the corridor when the one doing the tapping stopped. Arthur stopped. The tapping had been metronomic, regular, and its sudden absence was louder than any sound could have been. The infected figure stood still for a moment. Then very slowly it began to turn. Arthur had the crowbar up and moving before conscious thought engaged. Not because he'd planned it. The plan had been to get through without contact. But because between the moment the figure began to turn and the moment it fully turned, there was a window of approximately 2 seconds, and in that 2 seconds there was a choice between half a second of violence and everything after. And the math resolved cleanly and without argument. He moved fast, the infected turned. He was already past the point of return. The second and third figures responded to the impact sound, their heads coming around with that wrong, puppet string motion, and then Benjamin was there with the pipe. And for a period of time that Arthur could not later accurately estimate, they were in the corridor doing the ugly, necessary work that the situation required. And at the end of it, Arthur was breathing hard, with his hands braced against his knees. And Benjamin was standing with the pipe held down at his side, and they were both still themselves. Which was the important part. Which was always the important part. Leticia had not stopped walking. She was at the roof staircase door at the end of the corridor, hand on the handle, looking back at them. Her expression was not afraid. It was something else, the expression of someone who has crossed a line in their understanding of the world, and is now on the other side of it, and is cataloging how that feels with the same methodical attention they'd bring to any other data set. Go, Arthur said. The roof staircase was clear. The roof was cold and immensely, almost offensively normal in the way of open sky. The stars were still up there, which Arthur found genuinely strange. The stars being up there and doing their regular star business while the ships hung below them in the atmosphere, vast and dark, and lit from within by the same sub-umber light that had been bleeding into the facility's sensor logs since hour 1. He could see 2 of the ships from up here. They were not moving. They had not been moving in days. They were simply present. The way a mountain was present, with the same implication that your feelings about them were irrelevant. The HVAC control node was a gray metal cabinet bolted to the concrete housing of the main vent system. Leticia crossed to it immediately, unslinging the laptop bag, kneeling in front of the cabinet. She had it open in under a minute. She'd studied the building blueprints from the archived facility documentation, and had spent the previous evening mentally rehearsing this part with the focus of someone who understood that when you got here, you would not have time to hesitate. Connect here, she said, pointing. And here. Arthur knelt beside her, held the cables while she soldered 2 micro-connectors to the board inside the cabinet. The work required her to hold the soldering iron perfectly steady while lying half sideways on a rooftop in the dark, and she held it perfectly steady without comment. Benjamin stood at the roof access door. He'd jammed the handle with his pipe, not permanent but enough, and he stood with his back to the door and his face to the sky, watching the ships. Arthur heard him say something under his breath. Not a prayer, exactly. Not in any formal sense. More the kind of speech you direct at things that cannot hear you because it needs to be said. Because some feelings need to be given a direction even when there's no one to receive them. Ready, Leticia said. She had the emitter array extended. The speakers were small, repurposed from a pair of monitor speakers from the electronics lab, and they looked absurdly modest for what they were supposed to accomplish. She looked at Arthur, In the ambient light from the ships, her face was all shadow and angle, and she was still wearing the dry erase marker behind her ear, and at that moment she looked to Arthur like the most competent human being he had ever met. "Before do it," he said. "How certain are you that this works?" She thought about it. 60% chance of local interference. Maybe 20% chance we get a cascade effect through the building's resonant structures, which would extend the radius. Lower probability that it propagates further. She paused. But the math is sound. The dependency exists. "I'm certain of that." "Good enough," Arthur said. "There's something else. If the ships are monitoring the acoustic environment, which they are, they must be. This whole system requires feedback. Then the countersignal is going to look like interference to their monitoring system. Like a noise source. Like a disruption in their broadcast fidelity, they'll try to compensate." Arthur looked at the ships. "How will they compensate?" "I don't know," Leticia said. "I don't know what they'll do when something disrupts a system they believed was perfect. I don't know if they've ever encountered something that disrupted it." She looked at him steadily. "But I think if they've studied us long enough to build this system, and they built it to work on creatures whose primary adaptation is pattern recognition and tool use, they may not have fully accounted for the possibility that the creatures in question would notice the pattern." Arthur stood up, looked at the ships for a long moment. They were enormous and cold, and they had come across whatever incomprehensible distance, with a plan that was elegant and specific and built on a deep understanding of human neurology. And they had done everything right, and they had done it against an animal that had spent 4 million years learning to solve exactly the kind of problems that didn't seem solvable. "The thing about humans," Arthur said, to no one in particular, to the ships, to the stars behind the ships, to his sister watching the sunrise from a rooftop in Villa Mariana, "is that we're bad at dying in the way you planned." He looked at Leticia. "Do it." She activated the emitter. The sound it produced was not a sound exactly. It was below the threshold of hearing, a presence rather than a noise. A thing you felt as a faint pressure change in the eardrums and a slightly vertiginous rearrangement of the space behind your eyes. Arthur pressed both hands flat against his temples by reflex, a gesture that did nothing useful but felt correct. Benjamin turned from the door. For the first 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the ships moved. Not dramatically. No science fiction had ever prepared Arthur for how undramatic it would actually be. How the most significant moment of his life would look from the outside like a very large shadow shifting slightly, like a cloud reassembling. Both ships, the two he could see from the roof, rotated slowly the way a satellite dish rotated when it was reacquiring a signal. A sound came from them, not the subharmonic pulse. Something different, something higher and more complex, and Arthur felt it in his molars, and in the small bones of his ears, and in a part of his cognition he didn't have a name for. "It's working," Leticia said. Her voice was very controlled, and her hands were not shaking. "The interference is registering. Look at the counter on the oscilloscope. The ambient broadcast frequency is fractioning. Is it breaking? Not yet. Wait." She was watching the screen. "They're compensating. They're increasing output in the frequency range adjacent to the counter signal. They're trying to." The pulse from the ships intensified. Arthur's vision blurred at the edges for a moment. A headache blooming behind his left eye with the sudden specific authority of a migraine. He gripped the edge of the vent housing, stayed upright, looked at Leticia. "Can you match it?" "I can adjust the counter, but if they keep escalating..." "Match it," he said. She adjusted. Her fingers on the laptop keyboard were fast and certain. And here is what no one, not the builders of the ships, not the architects of the signal, not whatever intelligence had spent years of patient study mapping the amygdala resonance of a species that was slow and fragile and prone to emotional reasoning, and not technologically sophisticated by the standards of the galaxy. Here is what none of them had fully accounted for. The escalation was symmetrical in a way it shouldn't have been. If the countersignal had been generated by the machines, by automated systems, by anything with a fixed parameter and a linear response curve. But Leticia was not a fixed parameter. Every time the ships increased output, she did not simply mirror the change. She adjusted, anticipated, modeled the next step in the escalation sequence before it arrived. Because she had been watching the waveform for 2 days, and she had built a mental model of its structure that was now more complete than the ship's own monitoring system could compensate for. She was outpacing them. It was not the crowbar and the pipe. It was not the cold endurance of 3 days in a barricaded room. It was this. A 26-year-old biophysics researcher with a headache and a dry erase marker behind her ear, lying sideways on a rooftop, adjusting a homemade oscilloscope signal in real time, understanding a system better than its creators understood that it could be understood. The pulse from the ships stuttered. Arthur felt it as a sudden relief behind his eyes, a pressure releasing, and he realized he hadn't noticed how much of the headache was the pulse itself. Present for so many days it had become indistinguishable from the baseline, until it faltered. "There," Letitia said very quietly. "There," the stuttering continued, became irregular, the ship's rotation slowed. And then, this was not visible. This was something Arthur only knew later. When Letitia explained it, the subharmonic broadcast dropped to a fraction of its previous intensity. Not gone but fractured. No longer the coherent modulated signal it had been, but a scatter of competing frequencies that could no longer perform the precise amygdala priming the system required. And in the corridors below, the infected stopped. Not immediately, not all of them. But Benjamin, who was watching through the access door glass, said, in a voice that had dropped to a whisper without him noticing, "Something's changing." The three in the east corridor. There, he stopped. "They're sitting down." Arthur crossed to the door and looked through the glass. In the amber emergency light in the corridor below the stairwell landing, he could see two figures. They had subsided against the wall, with the boneless, confused motion of people coming out of anesthesia. Not threatening, not aggressive, deeply and obviously disoriented. One of them was touching its own face with an expression that could almost be read as bewilderment. "The secondary agent," Letitia said. "Without the acoustic priming, it can't maintain whatever the state is. The neurological change requires constant reinforcement from the frequency signal. Without it, it reverses? Maybe, for some of them. I don't know how long they've been exposed. I don't know what the damage profile looks like. But the mechanism." She was looking at the oscilloscope screen. "The mechanism is broken. As long as we maintain the counter signal, the priming fails." Arthur stood at the edge of the roof and looked at the ships. They were still there. They would be there for a long time. Whatever came next, whatever the ships did when their primary system failed, whatever forces were still available to them, whatever the scale of what was happening beyond Sao Paulo and beyond Brazil and beyond everything Arthur could see from this rooftop, none of that was resolved. None of that was answered. But a thing had been learned. A seam had been found in a system that had been built to be seamless. And the thing about seams once found was that other hands could work them. Researchers in other cities, engineers in other buildings, people who had not yet found the right door to open. Arthur thought about the legal pad on the bench oscilloscope in Sector 4, covered in Letitia's small, dense, precise handwriting. He thought about his sister watching the sunrise. He pulled out his phone, dead since day 2, and for a moment he just held it. Then he put it back in his pocket and sat down on the concrete of the rooftop with his back against the vent housing, and his face turned up to the sky where the stars were doing their regular star business, and he stayed there. Benjamin came and sat beside him without asking. He set the pipe down between them and leaned his head back against the vent housing and breathed. Letitia sat cross-legged on the rooftop with the laptop balanced on her knees, watched the oscilloscope trace and made very small, very careful adjustments every few minutes. And she did not look tired, or if she looked tired, she also looked like someone who was doing exactly what she needed to be doing and knew it. After a while, Benjamin said, "Do you think anyone else figured it out? The signal thing, the counter frequency?" "I don't know," Arthur said. "What if we're the only ones?" Arthur thought about this for a moment. "Then the legal pad in Sector 4 is going to do a lot of work." Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that surprised Arthur. He laughed. Not a lot. Not the full and easy laugh of an uncomplicated situation, but a real laugh, the kind that comes from a place that is still intact, still recognizably human, still capable of finding the small absurdity inside the large catastrophe. And it lasted only a few seconds and then it was gone, but it had been there, and that had been enough. Above them, the ships rotated in their slow, acquiring way, searching for a signal that kept refusing to stay still, kept changing, kept answering with something they hadn't modeled. The specific, infuriating, impossible to account for elasticity of a mind that had not been designed for this exact situation, but was refusing to be defined by that. The pulse stuttered. Letitia adjusted. The stars continued their business. And Arthur Mello, who had been a network infrastructure technician, and was now something he didn't yet have a word for, sat on a rooftop in Sao Paulo with a pipe between himself and a teenager he'd known for 3 days, watching a 26-year-old researcher dismantle the most sophisticated neural suppression system ever deployed against a sentient species, one small careful key press at a time. And he thought, "We are not easy to kill, we have never been easy to kill, and whatever you built this for, whatever species you were expecting to find, you should have done more research." The counter signal held. In the building below them in the amber-lit corridors, the infected continued their slow, confused return to whatever pieces of themselves remained. Some would come back. Some would not. Arthur did not know yet which category most of them fell into, and he would not let himself calculate the odds until morning, when there was light, when the work of the next phase could begin in earnest with eyes open and hands ready. But the signal held. He pressed his palms flat against the concrete, felt the cold of it, the specific, unambiguous solidity of a surface that had no interest in his neurology, that had been poured and cured and would outlast everything happening above it without any particular opinion on the matter. That was enough. That was the ground under his feet, the floor of the thing, and from a floor you could build. Leticia tapped twice on the oscilloscope housing, a sound that had no meaning except that she'd established it as her way of saying something that didn't need a word. And Arthur tapped twice on the vent housing in return. And Benjamin, who had been watching them, tapped twice on the concrete beside him, and they stayed there on the roof of the Federal University's Computational Sciences Annex. 3 people who had been handed a problem of civilizational scale and had approached it the way any good technician approached any problem. By refusing to accept that it couldn't be understood, the ship circled, searching the signal held, below in a building that was slowly, cautiously, in the smallest possible increments beginning to wake up. A legal pad of handwritten notes sat on a bench oscilloscope, waiting for whoever came next. The stars did what stars do, and humanity, which has always been very bad at dying in the ways that other things plan for it, kept working.